George Harrison spent decades telling the world that peace, forgiveness, and spiritual devotion were the only things worth chasing in life. He meditated every morning, chanted mantras in his garden, and told interviewers again and again that holding on to anger only poisoned the person holding it. And yet, there was one man George Harrison never forgave. A man he once called friend. A man he trusted with his money, his career, and his reputation. When that trust was broken, George didn't yell, he didn't sue for headlines, and he didn't go on television to vent. He simply shut the door and never opened it again. What that man did to George Harrison was so devastating that even now, decades later, fans who learn the full story can barely believe it actually happened to the gentlest Beatle of them all. When the Beatles broke apart in the spring of 1970, 3 of the 4 men went on to chase very different versions of freedom. John Lennon wanted to provoke. Paul McCartney wanted to keep making pop music with a new band. Ringo Starr wanted to enjoy himself. George Harrison wanted something quieter than all of that. He wanted a life where nobody controlled his songwriting, nobody dictated his beliefs, and nobody demanded he perform a version of himself that had stopped feeling real years earlier. At only 27 years old, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a sprawling triple album packed with songs he had been forced to shelve for years, while John and Paul dominated the Beatles' output. It became one of the best-selling and most critically respected solo records of the entire decade. Suddenly, the quiet Beatle wasn't quiet anymore. He was arguably the most successful ex-Beatle in the world, at least for a moment. But fame and money never seemed to be what drove George. Friends recalled that he was far more interested in his garden at Friar Park, his growing devotion to Hindu spirituality, and his fascination with Indian classical music than he ever was with expanding a business empire. He gave money to causes he believed in. He funded projects nobody else wanted to touch. He wasn't chasing wealth. He already had more than he needed, and what he wanted now was purpose. That desire for purpose is exactly what led him into the most damaging professional relationship of his life. Sometime in the late 1970s, George Harrison was introduced to a sharp, confident American businessman named Dennis O'Brien. By most accounts, O'Brien was charming in the way that successful deal-makers often are, quick with numbers, comfortable in boardrooms, and always ready with a solution to whatever problem was in front of him. For a man like George, who had spent his entire adult life being managed, contracted, and financially handled by other people since he was a teenager, O'Brien looked like exactly what he needed. Someone competent enough to handle the business side of life, so George could focus on music, meditation, and his family. The 2 men didn't just become business partners. They became something closer to friends, or at least George believed they had. He trusted O'Brien enough to hand him significant control over his finances and his growing list of creative ventures. And in 1978, that trust turned into one of the most unusual film production companies in British history, Handmade Films. The story behind its creation says everything about who George Harrison actually was. Monty Python's Terry Jones and Eric Idle had been developing a religious satire called Life of Brian, but at the last minute, the studio backing the project got nervous about the subject matter and pulled its funding entirely. The production was about to collapse. George Harrison, a lifelong Monty Python fan, decided he simply wasn't going to let that happen. He personally financed the film with several million pounds of his own money, reportedly mortgaging property to make it happen, all so the movie could get made. He later joked that it was the most expensive movie ticket ever purchased, because financing the entire film was essentially his way of buying himself a seat to watch it. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Life of Brian became a controversial, wildly successful hit, and Handmade Films didn't stop there. Over the following decade, the small studio George had built almost by accident produced a string of celebrated British films, including Time Bandits, The Long Good Friday, Mona Lisa, and With Nail and I. For a man who never asked to be a movie mogul, George Harrison had quietly become one of the most respected independent film financiers in the country. To the outside world, it looked like a perfect partnership. George provided the vision, the money, and the credibility. Dennis O'Brien handled the deals. Together, they seemed unstoppable. Behind the scenes, something was already going wrong. By the late 1980s, cracks were starting to show. George Harrison was never someone who obsessed over spreadsheets or quarterly reports. That had always been the arrangement. He trusted O'Brien to handle the money so he wouldn't have to think about it. But even a man who paid little attention to finance began to notice that something fell off. Handmade Films had produced hit after hit, films that critics loved and audiences paid to see, and yet the actual financial picture behind the company kept growing murkier instead of clearer. The more George started asking questions, the less satisfied he became with the answers. According to later court testimony, it emerged that O'Brien had allegedly entered into business transactions without proper authorization, blended company assets with his own personal interests, and failed to provide the kind of transparent, honest accounting that a business partner is supposed to provide. For years, George had operated on trust alone, assuming the man managing his money was doing right by him. Slowly, painfully, he came to believe that trust had been exploited on a massive scale. George Harrison was not a man who enjoyed conflict. Those who knew him described someone who avoided confrontation whenever he possibly could, someone who would rather walk away quietly than create a public spectacle. But by 1994, he felt he had run out of quiet options. He filed a lawsuit against Dennis O'Brien in London's High Court, accusing his former friend and business partner of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and financial mismanagement involving millions of pounds tied to Handmade Films and other jointly held companies. O'Brien didn't back down. He denied every accusation and fired back with counterclaims of his own, insisting he had always acted in George's best interests, and suggesting that Harrison himself had simply been too disengaged from his own business affairs to understand what had really been happening. What followed was years of grinding legal warfare. Private financial records, personal correspondence, and years of contracts were dragged into open court and picked apart line by line. A friendship that had once produced some of Britain's most beloved films had curdled into one of the ugliest legal battles of George Harrison's life. When the ruling finally came down in 1996, it was a resounding defeat for Dennis O'Brien. The High Court found that O'Brien had indeed breached his fiduciary duties and had acted improperly while managing George's business affairs. Harrison was awarded substantial damages, reportedly north of $10 million, though the final figures were complicated further by subsequent settlements and appeals in the years that followed. For George, the money was almost beside the point. What mattered was the confirmation, in a court of law, that his instincts had been correct all along. He hadn't imagined the betrayal. He hadn't overreacted. A man he had once considered a friend had, in fact, taken advantage of him for years. What happened next tells you everything you need to know about George Harrison's character. He didn't do a victory lap. There were no interviews gloating about the verdict, no attempts to publicly humiliate the man who had wronged him, no petty statements to the press. He simply went quiet. Friends noted that George almost never brought up Dennis O'Brien's name again for the rest of his life. The silence wasn't weakness. It was George's version of finality. As far as he was concerned, that chapter of his life was closed permanently, and there was nothing more to say about it. This is the part of George Harrison's philosophy that so many people misunderstood. He spoke constantly about the importance of forgiveness, about letting go of anger, because carrying it only harmed yourself. But for George, forgiveness didn't mean pretending the betrayal never happened. And it certainly didn't mean opening the door back up to the person who had hurt him. He could release his anger internally while still refusing, absolutely, to ever put himself in a position to be hurt by that person again. Peace of mind and self-protection in George's world were not contradictions. They worked together. The Handmade Films betrayal reshaped how George approached the rest of his life. He became noticeably more guarded, more selective about who he allowed close to him, and increasingly convinced that fame and success attracted not just admiration, but also people looking to exploit both. It was a hard lesson, learned late, and it never fully left him. If George believed the worst was finally behind him by the late 1990s, life had other plans. He had rebuilt his sense of peace at Friar Park, The sprawling Victorian estate in Henley-on-Thames that he had purchased decades earlier and transformed into an elaborate, almost magical garden sanctuary spread across more than 30 acres of lakes, woodland, and carefully tended grounds. It was the one place in the world where George felt fully protected from the chaos that had followed him since Beatlemania first exploded. That sense of safety was shattered on the night of December 30th, 1999. In the early hours of the morning, a disturbed intruder scaled the walls of Friar Park and broke into the house carrying a kitchen knife. He confronted George and his wife, Olivia, inside their own home. The attacker, reportedly convinced he was on some kind of religious mission connected to obsessive beliefs about the Beatles, launched a brutal assault. George, then 56 years old and a lifelong advocate of nonviolence, was stabbed repeatedly and suffered a punctured lung along with other severe injuries. For a terrifying stretch of time, Olivia genuinely believed she was about to watch her husband die in front of her. She refused to freeze. Fighting back with astonishing courage, Olivia struck the attacker with a fireplace poker and a heavy table lamp, buying enough time for the assault to be interrupted and for police to arrive and take the intruder into custody. George survived, but only after emergency surgery to repair the damage to his lung. Physically, he would go on to recover. Emotionally, those close to him said he was never quite the same. The illusion that Friar Park was untouchable had been permanently broken, and George became even more private, even more protective of the small circle of people he allowed near him. As if surviving a home invasion wasn't enough, George's body was already fighting a much quieter war. He had beaten throat cancer in 1997, but in 2001, doctors delivered devastating news. The cancer had returned, this time in his lungs, a disease he openly linked to his own decades of smoking. He underwent surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota to remove part of the affected lung, and for a brief period, there was real hope that the procedure had worked. That hope didn't last. By the summer of 2001, doctors discovered the cancer had spread to his brain. George sought treatment in Switzerland before eventually traveling to the United States for further care. Through all of it, those around him remembered the same quality that had defined him for decades, a striking calm in the face of suffering. His deep immersion in Hindu philosophy had convinced him, long before his diagnosis, that death was not an ending to fear, but simply another transition in a much longer spiritual journey. He spent his final months focused on prayer, meditation, and the people he loved rather than dwelling on his own pain. By autumn of 2001, George knew he was running out of time. Yet even as his body grew weaker, those who visited him were struck by how unshaken his spirit remained. He wasn't a man consumed by fear in his final weeks. He was a man focused on gratitude. One of the people who came to see him was Paul McCartney, his old friend from the streets of Liverpool decades earlier. Their relationship had never been simple. During the Beatles' years, George had often felt boxed out by the towering songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney, frustrated that his own compositions, songs that would later be recognized as some of the band's finest work, had to fight for space on every album. Those tensions were real, and the media spent years exaggerating them into full-blown rivalry. But underneath the friction, the bond the two of them had built as teenagers chasing an impossible dream never actually disappeared. Just weeks before George died, Paul flew to see him in New York. Ringo Starr joined as well, creating one final, quiet gathering of the surviving Beatles. There were no cameras, no press releases, no attempt to turn the moment into a public event. It was simply old friends sitting together, talking, and, according to Paul, laughing. McCartney later said he considered himself fortunate to have spent that time with George, remembering that even in the face of everything he had endured, George's humor was fully intact until nearly the end. Ringo experienced his own unforgettable moment during that final visit. He explained to George that he needed to leave to be with his daughter, who was about to undergo surgery of her own in Boston. According to Ringo, George looked at him and simply asked whether he wanted him to come along. It was a small gesture from a man who was dying, but it captured something essential about who George Harrison really was. Even in his final days, his instinct was to think about someone else's need before his own. Throughout those last weeks, George also drew strength from the spiritual community, that had shaped so much of his adult life. Hare Krishna devotees chanted verses from the Bhagavad Gita at his bedside, and his longtime friend and mentor, sitar virtuoso Ravi Shankar, stayed in contact with the family. Olivia later said that her husband remained conscious of his faith until the very end and faced death without fear. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died in Los Angeles at the age of 58, surrounded by the people closest to him. His family statement afterward reflected everything he had spent his life trying to teach, that material concerns could always wait, but the search for something greater could not, and that love, above everything else, was what mattered. Tributes came pouring in from across the music world the moment news of his death broke. Bob Dylan called him a man who inspired love. Elton John praised his songwriting gifts. Countless artists spoke about the quiet, understated influence he had on modern music, an influence that had often been overshadowed during his lifetime by the louder personalities around him. But it was Paul McCartney's tribute that carried the most emotional weight. Facing reporters outside his home, visibly shaken, McCartney called George's death very sad, while also acknowledging that after years of illness, there was some comfort in knowing his old friend had finally found peace. He spoke warmly of Olivia's strength, asked the public to be gentle with her during her grief, and then said something that made clear how little their old creative disagreements had ever really mattered. He called George a lovely man and said simply that he loved him. George Harrison's life was full of extraordinary highs and devastating lows. Global fame before he was old enough to legally drink in most countries, a business betrayal that cost him millions and years of legal battle, a violent home invasion that nearly ended his life, and a cancer diagnosis that eventually did. Through all of it, one pattern remained constant. When someone violated George's trust, he didn't scream about it, and he didn't seek revenge. He simply walked away and never looked back. Many people misread that response as coldness, but it was really a form of discipline rooted in everything George believed about inner peace. He held onto the idea that forgiveness mattered, that carrying bitterness only weighed down the person holding it. But he also understood something that not everyone grasps. Forgiveness doesn't require reopening a door that led to real harm. You can release the anger and still refuse to let the person who caused it back into your life. For George Harrison, that wasn't a contradiction. It was survival. His music will always be remembered. His gardens at Friar Park still stand as a monument to the peace he spent his life chasing. But perhaps the most human part of his legacy is this quieter lesson, that even the gentlest, most spiritually devoted people have limits, and that walking away from someone who has betrayed you isn't a failure of compassion. Sometimes, it's the clearest expression of self-respect a person can offer themselves. What do you think? Was George Harrison right to cut certain people out of his life for good, or should forgiveness always come with a second chance? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the lives behind the legends.